So, moving on to the Sigma range of coarse rods. We've got 17 rods in the range in total, and I'm going to split them into 3 groups. The first group I want to talk about is the match and feeder range. Now we've got 4 different feeder rods. We've got a very specialised rod, a wand, and then we've got 3 match rods. So let's start off with the wand. Now the Sigma wand is a rod that has a huge legacy and reputation. It was a rod first developed back in the 80s, and it was the first of its kind in terms of developing a rod to fish with sensitive tips, lighter line, and at shorter range. Now we've brought the Sigma wand back into the Sigma family for this new range. It carries many of the similar characteristics of the original. It's supplied with 3 extremely soft and fine glass quiver tips. That's actually the medium tip. So here's the other 2, and you've got different length tips to allow for different sensitivity and bite detection. So as you can see, the tips themselves are very, very fine and very, very delicate. Now, although this rod was originally designed for fishing with smaller hooks and catching smaller fish, due to the revolution in commercial fishing in the UK, this kind of rod is actually becoming very, very popular, even on commercials, particularly when you're fishing in the winter, when the weights aren't so big and the fish aren't so big, but also when you're not fishing for big carp. If you're fishing for F1 and smaller match carp, a shorter, softer action rod is actually proving to be a big benefit for modern fishing. So looking at the other feeder rods in the range, we've got 4 rods from 8 foot up to 11 foot. So obviously the different length rods are going to have a slightly different action, with a softer rod being the 8 foot, working through and increasing in power up to the 11 foot. Now they're all 2-piece, which is pretty much essential nowadays for modern coarse feeder rods and match rods, enabling you to leave the rod set up with the reel and the line and the rig all ready to save you time when you get to the peg at the start of a match or your pleasure session. Again, shorter rods, like I mentioned about the wand, are becoming more and more important for modern coarse fishing. It enables you to play the fish more conveniently and quicker, and also because you're not having to cast so far, you don't need a long rod to cast big distances. So the 8 foot rod, you'd be happy using that for distances up to 20 metres, 9 foot up to 30 metres, 10 foot I'd say up to 40 metres, and that was the rod that I've been using today. Surprising actually how far you can fish even with such a short rod. These rods have got a lot of power. It's progressive power, which means you can punch a method feeder out like I was today, 40 metres, no problem at all. And finally you've got the 11 foot, which obviously is going to lend itself to longer distances, perhaps up to 50 metres. You'll cast very, very easily and efficiently. Another quick thing to mention about these rods is they've all got a nice progressive action, and you'll see that when I'm playing the fish that I caught earlier. You can see the rod pretty much bends from the tip all the way through to the butt. The power gets more progressively stronger, but you're not letting the rod lock up. So even at this price point, that's a really key feature to think about. All of the feeder rods are supplied with 2 tips. You've got 1 glass tip and you've got 1 carbon tip. So that affords you a slightly different bite detection between the 2. Okay, moving on to the 3 match rods, and we'll start with the 10 foot pellet waggler. Now, pellet waggler fishing is very much in vogue nowadays, and like I talked about with the feeder rods, you don't need a long rod, so you don't need a traditional 13 foot rod. You're not casting that far, and actually a shorter rod helps when you're playing the fish and you're getting match size carp close to the net. So the pellet waggler rods are the same in construction, in blank construction, as the feeder rods. You've got a good quality carbon blank, and we've got the same matte finish that we incorporated on the fly rods. So even though they are a low price rod, I think they look very classy, very tidy. All of these rods have got the standard DPS style reel seat, which is comfortable to use, reliable and neat. So that's a nice feature as well on this price point rod. We've also included a very small, neat hook keeper ring just above the reel seat so that you can keep the hook safely in situ when you're not fishing. If you're fishing with another rod, you're not going to get a tangle. So that's a small feature but a neat feature. And I should mention the guides. The guides are titanium oxide guides. So again, this is a good spec, a good quality guide at this price point. So moving on to the next range of rods, we've got 4 rods that we've developed specifically for Benelux and Germany. We've got 2 winkle picker style rods in 9 and 10 foot. Quite similar actually to our Sigma feeder rods. Main difference is these rods are slightly stiffer to allow you to cast heavier weights and heavier feeders like what we use on the continent. And also you'll notice that the guides are bigger. So the butt guides are bigger and the profile of the guides through the rod is greater in size. And this is basically due to the fact that on the continent the anglers use a lot of braid with shock leaders, so it enables the shock leader knot to fly through the rings a lot easier, and also it will help increase the distance on the cast. So you will notice even on the spare tips that you've got larger diameter guides on the tips. And these winkle picker rods are supplied with 2 tips, both carbon and both a bit stiffer than the feeder rods in the other Sigma range. One thing I should mention is that all of these tips do interchange. So even though we've got this continental range, these tips will interchange with the other feeder rods and vice versa. So that's the 9 foot, and we've also got the 10 foot. The casting weight on the 10 foot is up to 3 ounces, which is 90 grams. So they're quite a powerful rod even though they're a short length, and they're going to be perfect for fishing on the continental canals and lakes. So the other 2 rods in the continental range are quite specialised, and we've called them Continental Power Feeder. There's a 13 foot and a 14 foot. So these are the rods that are going to be perfect for fishing the bigger rivers on the continent, bigger canals where you're casting big distances. So where you've got to cast between 70 and 100 metres, you're going to be looking to these rods. And you have to say, for the price, you know, they're absolutely fantastic. They've got features and spec and performance that you'd expect in a much more expensive rod. You can see again the large diameter butt guide. And the bigger diameter guides on the tip. And that's the 14 foot Continental Power Feeder. So these small little compact range of 4 rods are going to be very, very interesting for the European market. The final section of rods to talk about we've called the specialist range. We've actually got 3 specialist rods from 10 foot, 11 foot and 12 foot. And these have become a very, very popular rod on the market based on the traditional Avon style of rod. So they're 2-piece and they're designed for fishing where you're going to be both ledgering and float fishing for bigger fish. So bigger than the match range, you're looking at specimen fish, and that's represented by the fact that the test curve on these rods is between 1.25 pounds and 1.5 pounds. So you've got a more powerful rod that's going to be very, very beneficial for pleasure anglers and specialist anglers where they're encountering bigger fish. A nice feature to mention is the fact that the tips on these 3 rods, you've got a screw-in tip guide. So you can still screw in a quiver tip or a swing tip if you want. So they're very, very versatile, very, very popular rods with a nice through action. So this is a wonderful rod to fish with and a rod that's sure to be very successful. And finally, we've got 2 pike rods. These pike rods are 3-pound test curve, and we've got 2 versions. We've got a 2-piece and we've got a 3-piece. So obviously the 3-piece is going to be more compact during transit, whereas the 2-piece is the more traditional design. These rods are going to be perfect for most pike fishing situations, using dead baits and live baits, and have got enough power and a nice through action to enable you to fish these baits at quite a long range. So that concludes the new Sigma range of rods.